Welcome to the 2019 Writers' Festival. I'd like to first acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we gather and pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. To that extent, I would like to start this festival by calling upon one of those traditional owners of the land, Geraint Steele, CEO of the Boon Wurrung Foundation, to offer us a welcome to country.
Well, thank you for the very warm welcome, and I'll try to keep it a little bit casual. I've been doing formal welcomes all day, being National Reconciliation Week. So firstly, I am the CEO of the Boon Wurrung Foundation, but that's not really the reason that I'm here. The reason that I'm here is because of the people that came before me. So people like my mum, Carolyn Briggs, people like my great-great-grandmother, Louisa Briggs, who was actually born in Melbourne about 180 years ago. So when we were getting the first migrant wave into Melbourne, with the British coming into Melbourne around the 1830s. In fact, in one of her interviews, Louisa talks about the third house in Melbourne being built, and a lot of things have changed since then. A lot of migrants have arrived at our doorstep, and Melbourne has changed. In some ways, good changes, and in other ways there's been some changes that we could probably do a little bit better. And it's good to see, being Reconciliation Week, that gives us time to sort of think about that. So, how do we change for the better in the future? Now, Louisa had a great responsibility because she was one of the last surviving Boon Wurrung people left. And the reason that I credit those people that came before me is because we didn't have written knowledge. We had oral knowledge, so we had oral history. And if it wasn't for people like Louisa taking the responsibility for that knowledge and then understanding that knowledge had to have continuity, had to last beyond her own lifespan, she took it upon herself to make sure that her children, so people like my great-grandmother, people like my mother, understood that culture, so she passed it down. She took responsibility for that knowledge, and she made sure that the next generation was equipped with that knowledge, so that people like myself can really appreciate that knowledge that's been passed down from generation to generation. Knowledge such as the rights of Tanderrum. Many of you might not know what Tanderrum really means, but we don't say welcome to country in Boon Wurrung, we say Tanderrum. Tanderrum is what welcome to country is. It's the traditional version of a welcome to country. And what it was a compact between the traditional owners and arriving guests coming onto our land. And it starts off with the creation story. So our creation story goes that the land that straddles the two bays, Port Phillip Bay and Western Port Bay, was created by Bunjil. And Bunjil created the Kulin. So the Kulin is our word for people. And he taught the people how to live with the land that he's given them. And he teaches them how to hunt and how to survive and how to cooperate with our neighbours and so on and so on. But then he makes us responsible for the land. So he makes us responsible for everything that we do and all our actions and how that impacts the land. And we have a responsibility for teaching other people who come to our country how to live responsibility with the land. And that's where the Tanderrum comes in. You see, Bunjil always taught the Boon Wurrung to welcome guests, but he required us to ask all guests to make two promises. The first promise was not to harm the land of the children of Bunjil. And without having any prior knowledge, you can understand what that means. It means don't harm the Kulin people and don't harm the land. The second promise was a little bit more difficult, and this is where the education comes in. It was to honour, respect and obey the ways of Bunjil. Of course, we couldn't obey the ways of Bunjil today. One of the laws of coming onto Boon Wurrung country is that you could only speak Boon Wurrung. I couldn't ask anyone to do that today. But what we can do is we can actually commit to the values of the Boon Wurrung. So we can commit to the values that made the laws. So if we look at all the laws and customs and traditions of the Boon Wurrung and Woiwurrung and Tunlurrung people, we can actually find some common values in those laws. Common values as such as the value of that knowledge, the responsibility that we have for knowledge. That's our first value. So we call this value Yelenge. And then there's the value of celebration, which is what we're doing tonight. We're here for the purpose of celebration. And this is what we call Jambana or Janabi. And that means coming together for a shared purpose. So whatever the reason is, something that we can identify, something that we have in common, and we come together and we celebrate that. Right? We make an effort to celebrate. Often celebration can sort of be left by the wayside, especially today, we're quite busy running around, getting on with life. Often we forget to celebrate, but celebration across the world, no matter where you go, it's used primarily as a community building tool. So celebration is very important for building your community and bringing the community together. The second value sort of balances that last value, the third value balances that last value, which is what we call the value of respect. This is a bit of an interesting value because it directly balances the last value, because while we're all trying to identify something that's similar between us and we want to celebrate the commonalities that we have to be very careful, because we have to make sure that we do also value the diversity within us as well. So we look at the things that make us different. We look at the things that make me different and the things that make you different, and we value those differences. So we don't only tolerate them, we actually value the differences in our community. And this is actually what keeps the community together. So if we bring the community together through celebration, we can maintain the community through respecting each other and valuing the diversity that our community has. The final value, and this is at the core of the Welcome to Country or Tanderum, and really at the core of reconciliation as well, is what we call honouring sacred ground. So honouring sacred ground is about paying respects to the stories and people who have come to pass on the land that we stand. For me, it's understanding that I stand on the shoulders of my ancestors. I'm privileged to be able to have their knowledge, that they maintain that knowledge for me. It's about understanding the country that I'm from, the country that we're all living today. So, think about those places where we live, the indigenous words that are still available today. Thinking about the country just underneath the concrete, what's there. I've been privileged enough to work on excavation sites, and there's still Aboriginal sites that are sitting underneath buildings like this, or not buildings like this, but some of the older buildings across Melbourne. And it's about paying respect and, paying respect to that 60,000 years of history that we've got. Not so much the last 200, because that really pales in comparison to 60,000 years of history. So it's understanding that, this land is much older than its European occupancy. So what we can do as a part of that Tanderum, so we have to agree to these promises. First promise, not to harm the land of the children of Bunjil. The second promise was to commit to those values. So those values, once again, knowledge, respect, celebration, and honouring sacred ground. If we can commit to those values, I can say sincerely, Womanjeka Merembik Bik Burongdam de Brabdanatawilam. This means, welcome to my beautiful home, or come with purpose to my beautiful home, land of the two bays. Thank you.
Thank you, Garen, for those incredible words. The 2019 Writers' Festival has been a work in progress for some time. Unlike many of our cultural events, this festival is a more nuanced and bespoke offer. It will be played out in the rooms of this centre over the next week or so, and I expect that it will be tantalising. I would like to thank all involved, the writers and performers, the festival sponsors, committee and staff, and you, the audience for whom we have put all of this together. I would like to point out that the Greek community is deeply committed to continue to offer a cultural program that celebrates its roots but also looks to its future. We do this boldly at significant cost but without any misgivings. And I'd like to call upon the man who leads us in this Greek project of ours, my friend Mr. Bill Papasteriadis.
Thank you, Dmetri. and we acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we gather and pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. So pride is what comes to mind as I stand before you. Pride that the event is here at the Greek Centre. Pride that the Greek Writers' Festival looks beyond the Hellenic borders and is appropriately titled and themed Diasporic Dialogues. And pride because of the expansive program, over 30 sessions, over 50 culturally and linguistically diverse writers and performers. So the festival for us, as a Greek community of Melbourne, it's a bridge that unites friends, it promotes discourse, and it'll become part of our conversation in our multicultural society, where quite often, as we see abroad, that discourse is now very much dominated by laikismo and ethnicismo, sort of two Greek words which I think will be developed in the course of the next few days. And what a program it is. From the haunting experience of the uncanny to the anarchy in Fitzroy. I mean, there are a number of miniseries here that I think will unfold in the course of the next few days. And when I look around this room, I see many friends, but more so, I see so much talent. And when I looked at the program, I noticed that about at least 20 of them were people that I've engaged and known over a period of time as president of the Greek community. That's the professor, who is, where are you, Professor? Vrasidas, who, the last time I saw him, he was in first class, travelling back to Australia. I was doing a tough cattle class, but that's okay. That's how us presidents travel, the real people. You were first class. And I'm sure you did have a good time. Stavro Messini, our own Stavro Messini, Charikla Cheristanidis, Dean Kalimniou, Teslisiotis, Dina Dunas, Christos Fifis, Dimitri Touradidis, Hellenikas, Jim Pavlidis, Tina, who I just bumped into the elevator just moments ago, Pio, Anna Hadjinikolaou, Gary Foley, Foris Kapitopoulos, Nikos Papasiriadis, that I bumped into once or twice as well in my life too. But I hope to make many more friends over the next few weeks, over the next few days, I should say. But it's not by chance or by luck that the event is being held here today, because, excuse me, because as a Greek community of Melbourne, we've invested heavily in education and also culture. And most of us are volunteers in that regard. So recently the federal government announced a $2.5 million grant towards a new language and cultural centre. We have set up a diaspora library on the level above us. There are well over 30 lectures organised by Nick Dallas as part of the seminar series. There are a number of conferences that are held here. We have 13 language schools, a grammar school, we have our theatre school, our ancient Greek teaching program, over 150 events in the course of the year. The busiest community, we say, globally amongst the Greek global diaspora. So the story continues, not only amongst us, but also, may I say, amongst emerging writers. Because only last week, Neos Cosmos published the stories of the Greek Community School of East Bentley in their own special newspaper. That is, young students as budding writers promoting their stories. And I've got it here, and I must admit, I read it, and it's in the Greek language. I can't imagine how easy it was for them. But it's fantastic. These are primary and high school students who brought out their own newspaper, which is published in one of our major newspapers here in Australia, which I think speaks volume about where we're going and encouraging those who will be the next generation going forward. And I know that Rena, our 3XY Antonia, has been promoting heavily her relationship with young writers, and the Kirika did in 3A and SBS, Rhythmosum Fresh, and of course, ERT and Antenna. So special thanks to Bozanakis, Muratidis, Touradidis, and also support from our festival staff, which is Messinis, Tsamis, Marcos, Gorniaidis, and Menidis. Also, thanks to Dmetri Kakmi, Hellenikas, and Dina Dunas for their constant presence. And can I finish with a line that's been used with me, but not often enough, I think. But I think it's a compliment, but maybe Dmitri can tell us in the course of this event whether it actually is a compliment. But they're the words, Besta Chrysostome. Is it a compliment, Dmitri? Sort of. Maybe. But I love that expression. I think it's a beautiful expression. And now I'll say a few words in Greek as well. Απόψε σαν κοινότητα και σαν παροικία ανοίγουμε τα φτερά μας. Δεν είμαστε ένα νησάκι εδώ στην Αυστραλία, αλλά συμμετέχουμε σε ένα διάλογο με όλες τις εθνικότητες με βαθιές ρίζες πολυπολιτισμού. Εκ μέρους της ελληνικής κοινότητας Μερβούνης και του Ελληνικού Κέντρου Σύγχρονου Πολιτισμού που διοργανώνουν το Φεστιβάλ Ελλήνων Συγγραφέων, σας καλωσορίζω απόψε εδώ. Θέμα του φεστιβάλ είναι η διασπορική διάλογη και αποσκοπεί στην προώθηση της ιδέας ότι λογοτέχνες από διαφορετικές εθνικότητες στην Αυστραλία έχουν πολλά να μοιραστούν και να μάθουν ο ένας από τον άλλο και να ενθαρρύνουν και καλλιεργήσουν πολιτιστικές και καλλιτεχνικές σχέσεις. And I think that's the nub of it. Really think that's the nub of it. Και με τον τρόπο αυτό η κοινότητα μας πραγματοποιεί έναν ακόμα στόχο της. Να έχει επικοινωνία με τις άλλες εθνικότητες της Αυστραλίας, ανταλλάσσοντας ιδέες, εμπειρίες και προγραμματίζοντας από κοινού για το μέλλον. Στόχος μας είναι επίσης να αγκαλιάσουμε τους νέους λογοτέχνες μας και να τους στηρίζουμε μέσα από το φεστιβάλ και τα πολιτιστικά προγράμματα μας, δίνοντάς τους τη δυνατότητα να προβάλλουν το έργο τους όχι μόνο στην ελληνική παροικία, αλλά και στον ευρύτερο αυστραλιανό χώρο, και το έδειξα αυτό πριν λίγο μέσω του Νέου Κόσμου και όλα τα άλλα τα μέσα ενημέρωσης που βοηθάνε σε αυτόν τον σκοπό. Διότι ό,τι κάνουμε δεν το κάνουμε μόνοι μας, αλλά το κάνουμε συλλογικά. Και αυτό που βλέπουμε σήμερα είναι μια μεγάλη συλλογική προσφορά πολλών ατόμων. Το Φεστιβάλ Ελλήνων Συγγραφέων είναι μια μεγάλη προσπάθεια, όπως εξήγησα, καθώς συμμετέχουν πάνω από 60 λογοτέχνες και το πρόγραμμα του περιέχει περισσότερες από 30 εκδηλώσεις. Είμαι βέβαιος για την επιτυχία του, καθώς έχει γίνει πολλή δουλειά από την Οργανωτική Επιτροπή και το προσωπικό της κοινότητάς μας, τους οποίους ευχαριστώ για την προσπάθεια τους. Εύχομαι καλή επιτυχία και ελπίζω η στήριξη όλων να είναι δυναμική, έτσι ώστε να διοργανώνεται στο μέλλον σε ετήσια βάση. Σας ευχαριστώ. Now I've done my little bit and I expect all of you to do your bits, but I've bought 6 or 7 books today. I'm going to read them on my way to Albury, Wodonga, where I'm heading off with my son, who's got a soccer game first thing tomorrow morning. So I have to leave you very early. In fact, he'll be doing the reading and I'll be doing the driving, and it'll keep us, vigorously in both awake. So congratulations to all, and thank you, and kalli επιτυχία for the next few days. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill, and drive carefully. Finally, I'd like to invite to the microphone one of the people that could explain it all, co-curator of the festival program, Mr. George Moratidis.
Thank you, everyone, for coming tonight. On behalf of the organisers of the Greek Writers' Festival and the Greek community of Melbourne and Victoria, we respectfully recognise that this event is taking place on the stolen land of the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nations. We recognise that the sovereignty of this land was never ceded, that no treaty was ever signed, and that the colonisation of First Nations people in Australia is ongoing. We, as migrants and children of migrants, acknowledge our implication in the legacy of this colonisation, that it is indeed a privilege to be standing on Bunurong land, and wish to pay respect to elders past, present and emerging. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land. This festival is a deliberate act of reclaiming our stake in the Australian literary imagination. When I say our stake, I think of, as a Greek Australian, who I am and how I am recognised is connective and polyvalent as a writer, a migrant, as bilingual, working class, Pontian, Peloponnesian, Melburnian, Thomas-townian, to name a few. Who I am has always fostered an emotional and psychological affinity with culturally and linguistically diverse writers and their work. Are diversity and affinity just words? We are in the Greek Centre for Contemporary Culture in the heart of Thomastown, on the land of the Kulin nations. Add to this the fact that over 300 different languages are spoken in households in Australia, and more than 250 surviving First Nations languages are still spoken in Australia. Where then does this all fit within the dominant narratives and self-mythologies of Australian society and culture and the literatures that reinforce them? Greeks have been writing in Australia for more than a century, especially prolific since the post-war mass migration, producing an enormous body of rich literature in both Greek and English. Given this, it is poignant that most of it exists within the landscape of Australian literature as an island. It is both an insularity of survival and a convenient invisibility to a mainstream that oft reduces it to migrant writing, outsider art, survival stories, trauma narratives. As a Greek Australian literature, we have unpacked the migrant suitcase 1,000 times in 1,000 different ways since the 70s. But now, what do we do with that which we have unpacked? Where and how do we put it? If we can consider Greek Australian literature as an established part of an emerging shadow literary imagination, changing experiences of migration, especially in these desperate times of widespread forcible displacement, compel us to reconsider not only our stories, but our modes of storytelling. The necessity and purpose of organising this festival developed quite organically as a kind of counter-narrative or a shadow festival, one that emerged in the blinding light of the Anglocentric literary culture in Australia and its assumptions and politics, conscious or unconscious. With this festival, we seek to challenge and to interrogate and to complicate the monolingualism and the monoculturalism of this literary culture. The theme, as you know, of this festival is diasporic dialogues, because we believe that the diasporas and communities across the ethnic spectrum in Australia have so much to say to and share with and learn from one another. Over the next few days, we hope to encourage and nurture such cultural and artistic relationships and collaborations. We feel it is crucial, now more than ever, that the Greek Australian community, and indeed all diasporas and their writers, play a vital role in the broader cultural, political and literary landscape in this country, and be recognised as such, not only as migrants or children of migrants or variously marginalised minorities, but as artists. Our difference as culturally and linguistically diverse writers are indeed our strength, offering a myriad of responses and perspectives to what may be common experiences or struggles or questions. Do we, for example, have common aesthetic considerations or artistic praxis in our respective negotiations of identity or trauma or cultural memory or bilingualism? How do our respective histories, literary traditions, practices of storytelling and transmission of knowledge inform and shape our writing? These discussions have indeed been taking place between culturally and linguistically diverse writers, but largely outside of a formal festival setting. Started in passing at readings or at book launches, begun by reading and seeking out and discussing each other's work. Having this festival is one way to continue these dialogues, to see and talk to and open up to one another on our terms. This festival exists against the odds, and only so with your support and encouragement. It is the culmination of a truly collective effort, with a lot of help from both within and without the Greek community. There are a number of people I would like to thank, without whom we simply would not have a Greek Writers' Festival. First and foremost, Dmetri Kakmi and Dmitri, the co-directors of the festival program, Helen Nikas, Konstantina Dounas, and Tina Giannukos, early members of the festival committee, Antonia Tsamis, Jorge Menidis, and Maria Gonidis of the Greek Culture Committee, as well as a number of writers, many of whom are involved in the festival, including Dean Kalimnu, Ling Tung, Lucy Van, Maria Tamarkin, and Hua Pham. And, of course, Bill and Rosie from the wonderful Paperback Bookshop. All have really gone above and beyond for the festival and supported it unwaveringly from the beginning. And for this, we are truly grateful. Testament to the grassroots community, very much punk ethos of this festival, many invited participants have even donated their time and pavement to ensure that it takes place the way that we had envisioned it. Indeed, it takes a village. And we thank you all deeply for helping to make this festival happen and for taking the time to be a part of it. It is because of your participation and your belief for the need for this festival to exist and these discussions to take place that it has come to be. This is your festival. Κυρίες και κύριοι, φίλοι της λογοτεχνίας, συνοδοιπόροι στη πίεση, καλώς ήρθατε στο φεστιβάλ μας. Thank you. And now, just hang loose and let Mr. Nick Tsiavos twist your melon a little and blast your viscera. Thank you. Maybe we should move.
You want to move the podium? Show me. Yeah. It's now become a performance. So just kick it over.
Yeah.
Ready? Steady. It's not heavy. No, no. Nope. Nope. Don't move it that way. And just put it down. There you go.
Thanks.
Ta-da. Hello. George couldn't afford a bouzouki band tonight, so we'll have to make do. Is it working, guys? Well,
Festival.
All right, guys, now the moment you've all been waiting for. If our rebels without a pause can make their way to the stage. Come on, rebels. Yeah. Come on. Come on up, Mario. Come, take a seat. Την άλλη πλευρά. Έλα, you guys sit there και Βρασίδα κάτσε εσύ εδώ. Okay. So please, ladies and gentlemen, make welcome Professor Vrasida Karalis, Dmetri Kakmi, and Maria Katsonis.
No, we have to be a bit more informal, as you understand, and we try to be because these lights here are like sort of again somebody is attacking us, you know. Just we don't have any clear view of who is in front of us. So whatever you say, and we will never be able to understand your reactions to what we say, right? You know, because we are blinded now, blinded by light. You know, just yeah, that's it. All the vampires amongst us are terrified tonight. So I apologize for myself. I came from Sydney. It was a lovely day in Sydney. And when we came here, it's so cold, you know, just we are shaking, which is really good, of course, as you understand, because we love these changes. Because we have to discuss today with two, as the program calls them mavericks of the Greek Australian community, where I will see them extremely central, if I may say, and provocatively so, and sometimes, as you understand, deservedly so, as you understand, because, of course, what we know about the Greek Australian community, or the Greeks who write, because I said the program is called The Greeks, is that we are very conventional. Actually, we're so mainstream that we become so boring. And we are not simply boring, but we are boring to ourselves. I mean, you know, we have repeated so many times what we are, the boring stuff is about us, that we have not simply convinced ourselves that we are boring, but we enjoy our boredom. You know, just it's la nuit de Melbourne, as you understand, right? You know, just, you know, if I may say that in French. But amongst us, I think, there are some very interesting, I wouldn't call them mavericks, but extremely explosive geniuses, I would say, who appear and actually rearrange and recalibrate what we try to do. I'm a professor of Greek, as you understand, so I must be the most important bastion of conservatism, as you understand, right? Just don't shoot me, because I deserve it. You know, I deserve to be, you know, executed, right? Because I'm so conservative. But as I see the program here, we have so many interesting people, actually, who discuss about and raise issues that most of you will find sometimes difficult to deal with, offensive, sometimes will be inspiring. Some of us who are perverts will find it stimulating, and in most occasions there will be something very interesting to take with us for this discussion. So without further ado, I would like to introduce two of, I think, not maverick, but two of the central, I would say, representatives of an alternative discourse in Greek-Australian literature, Maria Katsonis and Dmetri Kakmi, whose work, as you know, for Maria, for the LGBTQI community, and for the diasporic dialogues that we have with Dmetri. I don't know, Dmetri, how you identify with, what you identify with, but you'll tell us soon. You know, I find it extremely, I would say, inspiring, and somehow they redefined what we mean with this. I have written a very brief introduction. This is my black notebook, but I didn't read it because I was so inspired by our two, by both of them. So, without further ado, what is this Platonic entity called Greek-Australian community?
I think I need the microphone.
You need the microphone.
You
Do we have only one microphone?
We only have one mic, I'm afraid. So we're going to have to pass it around.
I can project.
She can project much better than I can. She's got a booming voice, but I can't. I don't.
Booming lesbian, that's why.
Oh, we have one.
Comes with the territory.
Microphones, oh. Microphones for all.
So ask the question again, Vrasidas, because I have a very short
Let me
memory.
find it. Make it short, right? You know, just, what is the meaning of this expression that we use? Actually, I heard it many times. Greek-Australian writers, and do they exist? What is this Greek-Australian writing? Do you belong to them?
I don't belong to it at all. I think I'm probably the exception to this program at the moment, because I'm Greek, of course, but I was born in Turkey, a Greek island in Turkey, and I've lived most of my life in Australia. So really, I don't identify as a Greek writer, although the Australian discourse places me within that sphere. But predominantly, I think it's a fallacy that doesn't really exist. It's a lot of bullshit, really, that people create, and we have to play by the games. And I think one of the great things about the program we've put together for this weekend is that, in fact, we're trying to bust those lines and break out of them and create a new discourse and a new way of being. And quite frankly, I'm sick and tired of those delineations of Greek Australian writers or Chinese Australian writers. It's a lot of shit. It doesn't exist.
And it's so parochial already, isn't it?
It's
because we have been already second, third generation.
It was parochial in the 80s, and here we are in 2019.
Maria.
So continuing. Maria, what do you see?
So, for me, I'm going to take a fairly personal response, and then I'm going to build on what Dmetri said. So, Good Greek Girl was my first book, not as an established writer. So for me, it was about being a writer firstly and foremostly, even though it had the title of The Good Greek Girl on it. It wasn't about being a Greek Australian writer. It was about telling my story and my vexed relationship with my culture and how I came to reconcile that through my experience. What struck me, though, was, and I think it's more about the reader's response rather than setting out to be a Greek Australian writer, is that people from the Greek Australian community of my generation, my parents migrated, classic story, in the 50s, could see themselves in my book. And not only could they see themselves in my book, it was the marginalised and the disenfranchised who could see themselves in my book. The stories of Greek Australian LGBTI people. So I think there was a resonance for the Greek community aspect. I was really surprised. I think I wasn't expecting the kind of response I had from the Greek Australian community to the book. I found it quite overwhelming, particularly in that first year. But I go back to what Dmetri said about it's about the writing firstly and foremostly, rather than saying I'm here as a representative. You become one, whether you want it or not, because people kind of put you in that sort of box. But it's about the story first.
Maria, I'm actually really sorry. I'm going to take over a second. I'm interested to hear that you had a really positive response to your book from the Greek community, because with Motherland, I actually had the complete opposite. Most Greeks turned their backs on that book. The Turkish community embraced the book, but the Greek community turned their backs on it largely because they saw it as, they saw me as a traitor to the cause, because I wasn't lambasting the Turks. I was actually reaching out a hand.
Yeah.
So it was actually a very interesting response. And to this day, the book still hasn't been published in Greece.
May I say something?
but it's been
Because I
published
know,
in
I know
Turkey.
what you would try to say, but I'm an academic. I'm dealing with these academicians from the hegemonic Anglo culture who try to classify. The latest histories of Australian literature totally ignore you. They try to find labels to give you that you are that and that and that and that, but they never find a place within the wider Australian language, I would say, not literature, the way that literature is written. But the Greek Australian community, the Greeks, us here, they recognize, give you a nice haven, isn't it? They offer a refuge in some occasions. And we start with them. Do we hate them or love them?
Are you asking me that question?
Yes.
I spent the first 20 years of my life in Australia running away from Greeks.
That's what we want to hear.
Yeah.
Keep talking. Yeah.
I found the 1970s culture, Greek culture, in Melbourne absolutely stultifying and conservative, and I spent quite literally 20 years running away from it. It took me only until very few years ago, until I met George and yourself and Tina and a few other people, to start making tentative steps back into it again. And there's been a little bit of joy in that, but largely I actually still find what you said before is very, very true. We've moved forward, we have not moved an inch. Speaking as a gay man, I still feel that the community here is held back by incredible conservatism. It is as if we have calcified in a kind of 1950s mindset. At the same time, I'm actually very happy to see that the young people especially are moving forward in ways that absolutely delight me. So the contradictions are there, but aren't those contradictions there in every culture, in every community? Do you find the same?
Yeah, I like the concept of contradiction, because I have this bifurcated relationship with the Greek community of both love and hate. The hate emerged for me in the early 80s when I came out. Now we're talking about 1981 now, very conservative community, rejected and ostracised by my family. My mother at the time was working at the Proxenio, and it was the shame in the Merizili. I was going to bring on my family. They were going to have to move to Adelaide. It was just, truly, it was horrendous because of...
That's the worst fate in death.
Yeah, I know. But it was because they couldn't live with me, but they couldn't live with their own daughter in the same city. So the community essentially rejected me, and I rejected the community and the culture. And I finally came to terms with that about 15 years later, like you. I came a full circle in some ways, brought about by reconciliation, if you like, with my parents, and some other kind of learnings I had about myself, I guess. And then there was the publication of the book, and it was embraced by the community, and there was the love. But I can tell you, I experienced hate 18 months ago. I was one of 50, I think we were called prominent Greek citizens, Greek Australians rather, prominent Greek Australians who signed their names to a letter supporting marriage equality during the marriage equality debate. Well, we were vilified by members of the Greek community. We were vilified collectively, and because I have a fairly active social media profile, it's not too difficult to get my public email address, and I received hate mail. Appalling hate mail from members of the Greek community who called me a traitor, who said I'd made a pact with the devil. I mean, the emails were spitting with venom and hate.
Do we take them seriously?
Yeah, no, I did take them seriously.
You did?
I did.
Because I had the same. I signed the same.
I mean, I took them.
So, you know,
I kind of put them aside. I mean, I didn't. But I just thought that the discourse that happened around that time really showed the polarity, if you like, that still exists in the community. If you are, to use the term maverick, foot in each camp, however you want to describe it, that's why you go back to that notion of a sort of like a bifurcated relationship.
I mean, if we go back to the question, does this community, which is so ambivalent towards its own members and so conservative, I think in the Greek community we have postmodernism, modernism and pre-modernism in one go, of course, as you understand, you know, just as we see in here tonight, right? We are one, well, a sort of kind of thing. Do they need writers? What is the function of a writer within this community?
I think the fact that the three of us are sitting here on this stage on opening nights is a great deal. I really do. So yes, I think it's a remarkable step forward. But to answer your question, though, I think every community needs its writers. We are ultimately we're the voice of the subconscious that burbles to the fore. Really, that's what we're doing. And we speak the kinds of truths that are buried inside all of us at one point or another, and we help to bring them to the fore. And certainly with the work that I've done, not inside the Greek community, I stress, since the publication of Motherland, I've tended to sort of focused on more Gothic writing, short stories, novellas and novel and so on, which, of course, the Gothic is all about the subconscious. That's what it is. It's not about the horror stories, people bleeding to death and being horrified to death. It's actually about talking about everything that is buried within the subconscious, the stuff we cannot say in the light of day comes through in the Gothic. So really, I see myself in a way as serving a kind of public service. I tend to put on paper what I and most of us probably dare not say in the light of day. So
I speak as a memoirist in this sense, and I'm really struck by something that Joan Didion, essayist, New Yorker, Year of Magical Thinking, brilliant book if you haven't read it. All right, we can have a debate about that later. I'm a big fan. But she said we tell stories in order to live. So we tell stories in order to make sense of our lives, whether they're the stories we tell over our dinner table or whether they're the stories that I write on paper as a memoirist. So when I set out to write my story, it was about bringing these two senses of selves together, both of which were marginalised voices in the community. One is the Greek LGBTI, and don't forget the other half for me is someone who now lives with a mental illness and being able to give voice to that experience as well. And I go back to saying how those two stories have had such resonance for the people who identify with them. And I didn't intend to do that. I didn't intend to set out and become a representational figure. I didn't set out to become, as I describe myself, either a professional lesbian or a professional depressive when I go on the library tours. But if I can have that conversation, if I can tell that story, and if I can either connect with you in the audience, because you see yourself in my story, and I affirm and I validate your experience, or the Greek man, the Greek father who writes to me and says, you've changed my mind about LGBTI issues and it's going to change my relationship with my children. And you kind of think, well, it's worth the sweat, the effort, the vilification, all of it to be able to do that, to have that sense of connectivity and give that voice.
That reminds me of something that happened very soon after.
Yeah.
Very soon after Motherland came out, it was at a writers' festival. I can't remember where exactly. And a Greek man, after I finished speaking, I was in fact interviewed by a Turkish friend. She was online in LA and I was on stage. And she was interviewing me about the book. And afterwards, a Turkish man came up and shook my hand and gave me a hug. A Greek man came and spat in my face and walked out. And then a young Greek woman came up and I thought, get ready for another spit. And she shook my hand and she said, "Thank you very much. I never thought friendship between Greeks and Turks was possible. You've changed my mind. I thought it was worth the speed."
Yeah. Yeah.
It's not only the speed, as you understand, it's the ambivalence that Greeks have towards modernity and post-modernity, as you understand, as a community. I've seen them every day with my students as well. They're they live in hyper post-modernity, and at the same time they go to church and they fast, and they brought me the other day, I had some health problems, they brought me some blessed oil from the church to put in my ear,
Did you rub it on your operation?
I said I cannot, fry anything with this thing here. But I think in this case, can I ask you something much more fundamental for the writer in this case? What's the function of the English language in this case? Because I saw Greek writers here that presuppose that we write in Greek in this case, but you write in English. Has the English language a Greek history? Can it have?
Well, I'm not going to answer that last part of the question because I don't know. The answer is yes, it does, but an expert would be able to do a better job at it. So I was born in Turkey. I was born speaking Greek and Turkish at the same time. I came to Panellists. And came to Australia in the 70s, and very, very quickly as I was learning English, I forgot how to speak Greek and Turkish. I can barely speak the languages now. It's sort of baby talk. So really, my primary language is English. I adore the English language. I love the English language. It has such subtlety, such nuance, such poetry, and I especially love the English language as it was practiced, spoken, written in the 1950s and 60s, the formality of the English language as we came to know it in the kinds of books I guess I was reading in the 70s. I was learning to read. And therefore, although I speak like a peasant, I write in a kind of formal, practiced English that is considered largely old-fashioned now. I was going to say my agent, I'll say my ex-agent, because we parted ways recently under dramatic circumstances, always considered my English to be very, very formal and very old-fashioned, and she was always telling me to relax.
Right.
So for me, the English language is a kind of saviour, to be honest. It is my saviour because I cannot express myself in my two native languages.
So it's very interesting what you say, because in Australian writing, I have written an essay on that. I call it the heresy of colloquialism. They always write in a colloquial way. They can't understand another formal way, as you call it, formal way of writing, beyond the colloquialisms of a sort of an imaginary working class lingo that they use, which I think it's so sort of, in my occasion, so illusory and elusive in most occasions, because the English language, as you said, is so subtle, and my perception, because for all of us here, so hospitable. I mean, leaves room for everyone to get in there, just there. Have you ever tried to write in Greek, Mary?
Oh, my Greek is kitchen Greek. I've got fairly good. Well, I actually speak quite well in a conversational way because my yaya.
And without an accent, I heard you. The way that you talked to me, I was terrified.
Well, because my yaya lived with us, and if my yaya didn't live with us, my Greek would have been worse. I was rebellious from a very young age, and my dad sent me to Greek school. I think I must have been about 8. I went to 2 lessons. It was held at the church with the local priest. Oh. At the second lesson, a little boy didn't know his alphavita. He went out to the tree, got a vitsa, and thrashed the kid. And I went back to Dad and said, "I'm not going back. I'm not going back."
I love the word vitsa.
I said, I'm not going. Well, I'm not going. I also know the word kutala very well for other reasons.
Oh my God!
My yaya threw it at me lots of times. Anyway, but I said to my dad, "I'm not going back." And he said the deal was he was going to get the Greek alphabet books from primary school, and he would teach me twice a week. I think I got to grade 6, and that was about it. I cannot read the Greek Neos Cosmos. Right. I mean, I really have to kind of piece the words together. So Greek for me as a language, it's an oral language. It's not a written language. It's a language that connects me to my family. So for me, like Dmetri, I love words. I love English words. And for me, that's always been the basic, the blocks, if you like, for me is a way of expression. Having said that, I did want the Greek language in some ways to be reflected in my work. So I do use phrases for which there are no English translations. You know, how do you explain to someone what philotimo is? I mean, I try and say that. I try and explain it because that was my father. That's the trait I inherited from him, and yet to balance that out, it's, you know, philoxenia from my mother. How do you explain those?
I've not said in your book because there's a lot of cultural translation.
Yes.
There. And you do it so effectively because you bring things.
And the other thing was really important for me is if you look at the cover for my book with Dmetri's available up the back and will be ready for signing. That's the ad from our publishers. It was really important for me for the title to be bilingual because you don't often see. So Good Greek Girl, to Kalo Koritsi. It originally wasn't called that. Actually, I was really fixated on a particular title because it kind of drove me to it. The book was originally called Zoe Semas because that's kind of fundamental. And when I met with a prospective publisher and she says, well, what does that mean? I said, life to us all. She says, no. You'll end up in the hippie-trippy section together with all the personal self-help books. No. But it's true. But she acknowledged, I said, all right. She was the one who said, we've got to call it the Good Greek Girl. But I said, you know, it has to have Greek on the front cover in order to find those two halves and bring them together.
Do you think that becomes an alibi for the Australian? You know, public for the a pretext, you know, to address issues. The Australian society, if I may say, that can address it only through each others, through its foreigners, through the people who cannot be incorporated in the whole thing. Because I said your book, I think, is totally different from the LGBTQI, you know, just literature they have seen. Because
it is.
You don't have these lurid details, you know, you don't have that trivialized sexuality that I see in many actually books that become dominant, you know.
I mean, I didn't set out to write a book that was going to be set in the LGBTI
of course not.
part of the book. You know, if you think about, you know, where your book sits in a bookshop, I didn't want it to sit in the LGBTI section, nor did I want it to sit in a self-help, mental health section. I wanted it to be, you know, represented for what it is, which is a memoir, the story of
I see it as a testimony most, a martyria in Greek. The Greek word martyria, which martyrdom as well, it comes out so vividly for your memories. It's like yours. I find it a book of immense and intense nostalgia in your moment. Is it true? For a childhood.
I would not go to nostalgia. I just want to follow on something that Maria just said before, actually, in regards to the way you approached your book. When I conceived Motherland, the intention was to not even make the slightest concession to the Greek community or to a Greek readership. I was so antagonistic about the Greek community that I didn't want any part of it. For me, I set out to write a book that would only be read by the Anglo-Saxon community in Australia. However, quite unconsciously, it was pointed out to me much later by George, in fact, the English is written in a way that reflects spoken Greek. I didn't even realise I was doing that.
I've told you that in an email as well.
Yeah, you told me that as well, you're right. So in fact, you may try to run away from your origins, but you really can't. But I would hesitate to call Motherland a nostalgic book. For me, it's definitely not a nostalgic book.
For your childhood. I mean, for a childhood.
For a childhood?
Yeah.
I think it's nostalgic of anything, it's nostalgic of a lost way of life. Because really the Greeks of Anatolia simply don't exist anymore.
No,
they don't.
No.
We number in a couple of thousand. They'll die soon. They'll be gone from Turkey. So really, if it's sorry?
The microphone, something happened.
Oh, aren't you hearing me?
No.
Something's happened. Thank you. Can you hear me now? Ah. Sorry. So if it's reflective of anything, I think it's reflective of a lost way of life. Is it nostalgic? I don't know if it's nostalgic. For me, it's a book written out of love and kindness more than anything else. And a kind of big fuck you, actually, to both Turkey for treating us like shit, and also to the Australian writing community. Because although I wrote it very consciously in a kind of English that I knew would appeal to a kind of middle-class Anglo-Saxon sensibility. Don't forget, I've been working in English publishing for 30 years, so I knew I was positing the book towards a kind of market. So it was a very practiced, very deliberately honed piece of work. And interestingly enough, they took to it like ducks to water. Having said that, they were also alarmed by the violence in it. But mind you, not the violence, the ethnic violence. They were horrified by the animals that were being killed in the story.
Yeah.
I thought, how typically Australian is this?
Yeah. Well, but I think your book has done something else for the Australian community, gave you, for the Australian writing, gave a sort of a kind of, the last, I think, 20 years, despite the fact that we have so many multicultural writers, that cosmopolitan transcultural element has been provincialized. And you brought something completely new, different perspective in the whole thing, which is, I believe, it was a Greek perspective on an Australian mode of writing. And I think you do it, both of you do it so successfully because, I mean, you don't have to declare that you are Greek to understand that you have a Greek perspective on things. And I think that's the most successful element of all because it's the invisible and the visible element of your narratives that you are a nice Greek girl. But this is...
She's not actually.
You are an unnice Greek girl, But it is, I would say, if I don't use this big term, universal story.
It is a universal story. I mean, my story is that classic, in a way, kind of heroes.
Coming of age as
story.
well.
It's a coming of age story. It's a story of redemption. My redemption, actually.
Exactly.
I'm not talking about the reconciliation aspect, the reconciliation with family, the reconciliation with culture, but the redemption of myself and what I learnt about myself as a result of my, particularly the early onset of my illness, and then what I learnt after, if we talk about the visible and the invisible, what do we talk about, what don't we talk about? Yes, it's okay now to perhaps talk about mental illness, but nobody talks about being a patient in a psychiatric hospital, which I committed
you're so true, because this is one
paper on that. And in part, I started writing the book to make sense of my own experience for myself before I realised that, hey, maybe there's a story here for others to read about.
So what did this book give to you?
What did it give to me? That's such a profound question for me as I sit here, because someone's asked me that question. This might be we both do the writers.
No, I wanted this question for both of you.
But no one's asked me that question. And as I sit here trying to put a coherent sentence together, I feel this kind of profound sense of emotion in terms of what the book has given me in terms of affiliation, the openness with which it's been received by the Greek community, by the LGBTI community, a sense of connection with people. It's given me a capacity to own my story, put it out there publicly, and know that it has not been whitewashed in any... I mean, I didn't set out to whitewash. I wanted to put out there a book that was an authentic expression of myself in all its glory. Foibles, good parts, the not-so-good Greek girl, the good Greek girl, all of it.
So did it change the way that you think about yourself?
I think the experience that led to the writing of the book.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And the writing.
The writing helped me make, as I said, I set out to write to make sense of my story about who I am, where did I come from, how did I come to the world, what sense did I make of the world when the world let me down, and that's, the schism that happened with my parents, what happened to me when I lost all my cognitive kind of capacity and then had to start anew. Right. That's the redemptive aspect, because literally my mental illness shattered me. It broke me into a million little pieces. And after 5 weeks of being in the hospital, it took me another 4 weeks before I could put one foot in front of another. And over a period of a year, I had to learn everything about myself again. And friends who know me say that knew me before the illness and know me after the illness, know that, say that they experience me differently now as well. So it's given me a very different sense of identity and who I am. And that's what the book has given me, the capacity to articulate that.
Well, that's amazing, isn't it? I think that's the most profound thing I've ever heard. It was, just very beautiful, because is that the same redemptive function for your book, Dave?
Soon after the book came out, a neighbourhood woman knocked on my door and asked me to sign a copy of the book for her. And as I was standing there signing it, she patted me on the shoulder and she said, "You turned out really well despite everything you went through." I had no... And I thought, damn, I always thought I was still fucked up. And I thought, what the hell does she mean? I actually didn't know what she meant. And I went inside and I said to my partner of 32 years, this woman just said, I turned out really well. And Lee, my partner, said, well, you did have a very unusual life. It's not a common experience. And I had never seen it like that to me. Everything that happened to us in Turkey, the violence, the horror, the not knowing whether you're going to live or die from one day to the next, was completely normal. I didn't know anything else. And it was only, I was well into my 40s, when I looked back, I thought, oh, I see. This book has actually helped me to make sense of my life. And my partner, Lee, said a lot of things now make sense to me. Having read this book, I think I understand a lot more about your behaviour. So I think I hate writing as therapy. I loathe it. And I discourage it in my students as much as possible. But much to my horror, it seems that I've done a similar thing.
Yeah, I just want to pick up on that point about therapy. I didn't set out to write a therapeutic book. Otherwise, I just would have written a journal. I wanted to write a book that people would read. So it couldn't be self-indulgent. It had to have a narrative. It had to have a story. It had to have well-rounded characters, even though the characters were kind of family. As Dmetri was talking, there's just one thing I want to say about what the book has given me. It's given me my family back. And when I say that, it is Greek family. My mother didn't talk to her brothers. There was a big falling out on this side of the family. There was a big falling out on that side of the family. Cousins I grew up with, hung out with, we didn't talk to each other. And the book brought us back together, and it started to close, in my generation, I'm talking so much, well, also the older generation as well, but it started to heal those schisms that had developed because of, tako thika, 30 years ago, and we don't know why, but it's now affected us, kind of in this generation, and it's brought that sense of family back together in my generation. I remember my book was launched at readings in Carlton, and I remember my Thea Despina, who's in her 70s, and very traditional Thea Despina, my Thea Maki, who features in the book, very groovy, very contemporary, very accepting. And I remember the person who was launching my book talked about me being a lesbian, and she must have mentioned that word in her speech 30 times, I think. And I'm looking at, what's Thea Despina going to think? What's Thea Despina going to think? And Thea Despina is just beaming. And I remember getting up on stage to respond to that and looking at my two aunts, and I thought, that's what's brought us back together. That's what's brought us back here now. So that's what the book gave me.
That writing leads to self-knowledge?
Yes. If you're a memoirist, it has to lead to self-knowledge.
As a reconstruction of the past experience?
I'm going to sort of recalibrate that question. I've actually found that writing, and I'm not talking about Motherland now, I'm talking about fiction that came after Motherland. I'll tell you a little story. I was recently invited to submit a short story to an anthology that's just coming out next month. It's a science fiction anthology, and the editor said, "Would you write a short story?" I said, "Yeah, of course I will." And I submitted the short story. And I've worked with this editor on and off for the last 20 plus years. And he came back and he said, "Dmetri, you know, I've asked you for short stories four times, and each time you give me a short story about a child that's being abused." I had never realised that's what I was doing. And when I looked at each one of the stories that he's published for me over the years, yes, it's true. In each case, you have an endangered child, whether it's sexual abuse or physical abuse or whatever, there's always a child at its centre. And unlike you, instead of being depressive and ending up in hospital and so on, I think I've sublimated all of this, and it's coming through in my work. I was sexually abused as a child before the age of 10, and it's coming through in the work. My father was a drunk and very violent towards my mother. It's coming through in the work. It's in Motherland, of course, but it's sublimated in just about every piece of fiction that I'm creating. I'm not doing it consciously. It simply comes through.
You don't have to.
These are the stories, I think. Yeah, I think every writer generally, I mean, you'd know this. Every writer, I think, we tend to circle around about the same themes. And each time it's sort of, you come at it from a different angle in order to try and understand or make sense of it. And I realised through the fiction, not through the non-fiction, because I write essays as well, the fiction is certainly the dark burblings of Dmetri Kakmi, and in fact the fiction that's come after Motherland is the dark undercurrent that runs under Motherland.
Because in the Motherland, if I may interrupt here, I strongly recommend you to read the book. I mean, despite, as you said, the dark underground currents that we see there, there's an amazing clarity of vision, of language. The language is luminosity of a Mediterranean way of looking at reality. And I love that because essentially your language is so pulsates, so transparent, and so, in this case, prismatic. You know, you can see, you can take sentences and analyze them in a form of, if I may say, you know, just we don't see so much condensation, so much density in contemporary Australian writing. And I think your book was a turning point in the way that we write history, write narratives about revisiting places, going back, reconstructing. You're the new Proust, I wrote somewhere,
I wish. You should see the new manuscript, you would not say that.
So where are we going there after Proust? But don't you think, am I wrong?
No, you're not wrong. I think Motherland is, if I may modestly say, extremely well written. It was deliberate. I spent 5 years honing that. But again, I think that comes out of the very fact that, I could read, write, and speak English better than most of my, fellow students within 6 months. Right. So I have a love of language. I have a love of the English language. I read a great deal. The first writings that I ever published were in fact poetry, right, not fiction at all. So, and also when I've written for newspapers such as The Age and et cetera, they say, write about this in 800 words. Oy vey, 800 words. So you learn to condense, you learn to sharpen, and you learn to pick words. But I'm also an editor.
Well, if I may say, I saw that and strongly recommend to find them on the net. Your essays on films, which are, I think, one of the most interesting sort of a ficto-criticism that I can read. And yourself and the critical element, intertwined in a through the film that you're watching. You know what? that famous film by Brian
The Brian De Palma,
Brian De Palma,
which one, the Raising Cain?
Raising Cain,
Right.
which is I strongly recommend to read because you need a bit of a shake up, your morality, your morals as well. Just if you start dressing up as well, just in the problematic. But your essay it was so, I mean, if I may say, balanced in between you and the movie, De Palma and the actual work criticism and this kind of, and the style of writing. Unfortunately, David Stratton never gave us something like that. I mean,
David Stratton had a broom up his arse, that's why he could never do that.
Controversial.
And really, it's interesting you raise that particular essay because, in fact, that essay about Raising Cain and Brian De Palma highlights something else that, the panel is sort of about mavericks and, being, revolutionaries or whatever. I'm nothing of the sort. I'm actually an absurdist, and the writing or the films that I tend to like tend to be absurdist or surrealist and extremes, and that's why I was able to write about Brian De Palma and Raising Cain in such a way. It's by drawing on an absurdist tradition of writing. At least that's how I see it.
And Maria, can I ask, as an activist, how do you see your role? I mean,
I'm an accidental activist.
accidental.
I was an accidental writer.
You're an accidental anarchist.
I wrote, it was my first book. You write a book, you send it out into the world, and you wonder how people are going to respond to it. And for me, part of that response was as I said, the two aspects. It's being LGBTI, but not just being LGBTI, being a female, right?
Yeah,
because,
that was my question. Now.
Right, because I'm the every time, and thank you to Neos Cosmos because I know that they're in the audience. But you want a view on LGBTI issues in the Greek community. We're now going to go to Maria because I'm happy to have my surname published. There are still people who will not have their surname published. Might be my age. Because of who might in the family know. Because
that must have been a terrible revelation, because Mediterranean men, gay or heterosexual, just say fuck off and leave me alone. If I like taking it, I'll take it and fuck off now. I'm not going to give you any logarithmo. It's what I'm doing. But with women, it's much more complex, the situation.
And I found myself becoming a bit of a pin-up girl, for want of a better word. Not in terms of, being solicited, but I started, no, seriously, I'm not talking about, that kind of pin-up girl. But again, I have an author page on Facebook and I would get messages. I'm 17 years old from a girl. I like dressing in men's clothing. I don't understand what's going on. My dad, my baba, half Greek, hates it. He's about to throw me out. What should I do? Right. And you start to become a bit of a lightning rod. For those other mavericks, because
or a symbol, because I think this is what I would like to point out with both of your books and your contribution to the Greek Australian community. You've, in different ways, you have become symbols of a reorientation within the Greek community. I think. Because I gave your book to one of my students. Her father was a priest, and he almost killed her when he realized that she liked women. Yeah. And actually I was called by the doctors, the hospital, to go and help a girl who was my student 5 years ago because her father tried to break her head against the wall. The charitable Christian priests, as you understand, all of them. And I gave her the book because, we became friends afterwards and the book actually saved her life. Yeah. And she told me the gesture said it was so symbolic because it made me realize that I'm not a freak.
And you're not alone.
And you're not alone.
And you're not alone. Yeah. There are others who have walked that same path, others who have experienced that same level of hurt, others who have experienced that same level of violence. It's one of the things I held back in my book was the extent of the violence with my father. That was for me life-threatening. That nearly did.
What infuriated your father so much?
I think for him it was an explosion that was driven by his shattered expectations. Firstborn, on the boat, this is the life that I wanted. For you, it was, and part of that fundamentally wasn't just the career and the education, it was marriage, it was the shattering of the expectations. It was he couldn't comprehend. I don't think he could understand it. I don't think he could make sense of his little girl, his pride and joy. I'd always been father's daughter, and here I am throwing everything back at him. Because he asked the question, for those of you who haven't read the book, I had come out to everyone in my family, cousins, aunts, friends. The very last people I came out to were my parents. And I was trying to work out a way of doing it and that. And I remember the way it happens is in my family kitchen, and my father just across the dining room table asks me in the kitchen table, you know, is it true what they say about you? And I said, I think what do you mean? You know, what are they saying about me? Lots of people saying lots of things about me. You know, I was 21 at the time, short hair, who knows what they were saying about me. Didn't go to the Greek dances, always wore trousers, you know, just didn't fit in. And he said, is it true? And he used the word, is it true that you're a homosexual? Right? He couldn't even say anything else about it. And it was in that moment that I had to, totally unprepared, either lie for the rest of my life or be truthful to who I was. And that's what provoked the rage. Obviously, he had been mulling over it, I suspect for whatever reason, but it was like it had destroyed everything he held dear. And it also destroyed the love that he had for me.
Right.
As well. So all of that broke in that moment.
So at least your father asked you. At least your father actually asked you. My father is 92. He just turned 92. He still doesn't acknowledge that his son is gay. As far as he's concerned, I'm renting a room in my partner of 32 years' house, and he still doesn't acknowledge that. And whenever the subject comes up, he just goes, "Vexero." And I think maybe the brain just doesn't understand, do you think? It's the most odd thing.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think there's something about the brain. Well, first of all, there's a part of the brain that doesn't understand, and then there's a part of the brain that doesn't want to understand. There's two aspects to that. I remember before I broke off relations with my parents because I couldn't take it was either arguments with them or stone cold silence. And I remember probably about a week after the violence with my father that he read something in the paper that said, you know, homosexuals die younger. That's what's going to happen to you. It was just some bullshit in the Herald Sun. And I thought, oh, okay, well, his dad's reading about homosexuals in the Herald Sun. So I went to the library and I borrowed a book written by parents of gays and lesbians from PFLAG. And I brought it home and I said, Dad, I know you're reading about these things in the Herald Sun, but that's not the truth. Here is something that might help you. And he took one look, this is what I thought the point of no return, took one look at that book and he just threw it in the front yard and said, don't ever bring that kind of filth into my house again. And I knew after that everything was broken between us. And when I set up house, I couch surfed for a bit, but when I set up house, he and my mother would never come to visit me. They could not acknowledge. That part of that part of my life, nor did they want to acknowledge it.
All of this in Greek?
Yeah.
All these discussions in Greek?
Yeah, most of the discussions were
because
were
I'd
in
like to
Greek.
I know that we're getting late and we have to finish.
We have to
wrap
finish
it
up soon, yes.
Yeah, I just want to ask both of you now, I mean, because you are, as I said, such symbols of reorientation in the Greek community. How do you see the future of this community? Do we have a future? Or we are slowly dying? Actually, we are zombies and we don't really know it. You know, and one day we'll realize that we are mummies walking. You know, then we don't have inner life. We don't have a symbolic language to talk about ourselves, and our adventure in history will evaporate like that. So you save the collective
actually,
memory.
as a great pessimist, I actually say great promise in our community.
Die, die, baby,
I
die.
think what I'm seeing at the moment is a kind of the community is changing. I'm seeing people, young men and women, who are marrying Chinese, they're marrying Vietnamese. My cousin recently took up with a Turkish woman, unheard of in the past. Another cousin is married to a black man from Africa. So I think, in fact, what will happen to the Australian Greek Australian community is that it will be subsumed and transformed into something else, like all Australian culture. I mean, look at the Anglos here. They're getting married to Chinese, Japanese, whatever.
But into what?
Into what? I think ultimately, okay, I've always seen Australia as a part of Asia. We've pretended this long that we're in fact a part of Europe. It's a lot of crap. We are part of Asia, and the very fact of this intense migration we've been getting from Asian countries, from the Middle East, from Africa in the last 20 to 30 years will ultimately change the landscape into something that I actually see really, really promising. Despite the alarmist politics that we're living with at the moment, I actually think there's enormous promise for Australia to become something new, something truly promising, and something that will look to the future of humanity as an amalgam rather than as little tribalist groups that are standing there snarking at each other. And that will happen whether the likes of Pauline Hanson, our current government, etc., resist. It will happen. You can't stop it.
Name me some Greeks who play that role in the Greek Australian community.
Well, you're asking the wrong person again, because actually, other than you, I don't know anyone, within the Greek community who plays those roles.
I mean, who are conservative and they want to maintain that idealized, totally, just purity of our tradition and race. We had the elections recently, as you remember, in Greece last weekend, and we had the person who elected the European Parliament who sold handwritten letters by Jesus Christ himself, all right? And
That's true, that actually happened.
Which is really good, as it sounds, because I was looking for one myself.
So-
But do we have a future?
We do have a future. I share your optimism, but I also harbour some pessimism. Yeah, I'm glass half full and a little bit half empty. And I'm going to pick up on your last point when I come to the half empty. The glass half full for me is, I think there is no such thing as a monolithic community. There's no LGBTI community. It is a conglomerate of communities. There is no one Greek community. It is a conglomerate of communities and then its relationship with other communities. And I think that there is energy and there is, as you say, from the young people who are viewing things incredibly different from the generation before them. I think nights like tonight and the kind of programming that the Writers' Festival is promoting shows that other energy. And that for me is the other representation, the other voices, the non, kind of, if you like, traditional kind of conservative. Where that glass is half empty for me, and this is where it's hard to, when we talk about where's the tradition, where are we if you like, still set in stone, we're never going to change, and that is the relationship between the community and the church, and the role that the church has to play in promulgating a particular set of values, some of which are held very dear by members of the community, the kind of voices that came out during the same-sex marriage debate. I mean, the church is profoundly anti-gay, and it came out as such during the marriage debate, where you had priests using the pulpit to exhort people, and I saw this, and I heard it from relatives who go to church, go sign petitions against Greek marriage, and because the priest says it's something that we should do, it's something that we should do.
They even got together with conservative Islamic communities in Sydney.
Yeah. So there is until we look at ways of how we can kind of break that nexus and the role of the church in community life, because it has a strong role to play in community life and espousing a particular set
You raise a
of,
very important issue.
of values, then I think we're not going to really realise the potential and the promise of the full glass. So that's why I still harbour some pessimism in that sense.
You raise a very important issue because also in Greece, because as you know, I grew up in Greece, and you know this nexus between church and society has never been severed. Right? We are semi-secularized society. I mean, I believe that Greek society is a post-Ottoman society, not even a Balkan society. You know, we haven't become that. We have failed to de-Ottomanize ourselves, or de-Byzantinize, because these two go together. But do you think that the young people here can do something about that? Because most of them go to church. They want to get married in the church. They want to, but they know nothing about theology, of course, except with the exception of Dean Kaldimnius, you know,
and
who
also,
knows
let's
everything.
not. I mean, I don't want to, you know,
all
demonize.
the others, you know, it's incredible that I have met, priests who don't know anything about the procession of the Holy Spirit from the Father and the Son. I freaked out. I said, no, we don't say that in the Orthodox Church. This is profound heresy. It led to the schism between the church. And what's the difference? There's a huge difference. What are you talking about? But can we do that?
Look, the church holds, I mean, we're moving kind of a bit away from it, but the church also holds a cultural resonance as well for a younger generation. I mean, I wouldn't consider myself to be particularly religious, but I will go, like everyone else, I will go to church at Easter. I persuade myself, I don't actually go inside the church. I'm one of those people who goes at, 12:15. Who might go kind of with that, so I can and in fact, I got very upset last year when the Greek priest started to give the liturgia half in English, because actually I could understand what was being said. It's like, no, I don't want to hear about God. With all apology, any apology to anyone, I don't mean to disrespect faith in saying this, but I go to church.
Disrespect faith, they fuck you up.
No, but I don't want to disrespect other people's faith. I go because it is of cultural significance and it reminds me, because I'm so, if you like, anglicised in some way.
Right.
It reminds me of my kind of cultural roots. So the church plays, I
The
think,
Jewish,
that has that kind of dual role, kind of keeper of the faith.
So
and
are
the
we
tradition.
going towards a Jewish cosmopolitan identity, you think?
I think there's a lot of my best friend is Jewish, and we talk a lot about the similarities between the Greeks and the Jews and the role of religion in cultural identity, not just as a practice of religion, if you like. For me, it's not a practice about religion. It's intrinsically tied to my cultural
and language
identity. The Greek language? Oh, yeah, the Greek language. My parents died many years ago. I pretty much speak 100% English now. It's probably no surprise, and it took me a while to realise that I go to Pram Market and every shopkeeper I visit is Greek. Why? Because that's why I speak my Greek on a Saturday morning. I just realised that's where I kind of gravitate.
You remind me, in 1943, all these great Jewish refugees went to America and they were learning English. So they said they have this incredible, that you would love that, this incredible dialogue. Are you happy? One said, they were German Jews. Said, happy I am, glücklich ich bin nicht. in German, but I'm not happy, glücklich, in German. Glücklich ich bin nicht. Is this the same thing? Do we say different things in one language and another?
I'm not going to answer that. I'm going to continue what Maria was talking about before. When I was 14, at Easter time, the priest, as you probably have experienced yourself, came to our house to bless the house, as they did in those days in Northcote. I was sitting there very happily, a 14-year-old, watching Bewitched. And nothing disturbed my Bewitched viewing. This priest sails in with his holy water and whatever that thing is called. And my parents say, you must stand up and kiss his hand. And I said, well, no, I'm not. I'm watching Bewitched. Samantha's about to cast a spell. I can't, And the priest continued to spray me with holy water and told my parents that I was the devil and they were to throw me out of the house. Imagine a priest telling parents to throw a 14-year-old child out of the house. So ever since then, really, but it had started a lot earlier, I loathe religion almost as much as I loathe politicians. So the two for me are married, but I can't even talk about religion without becoming apoplectic. Having said that, I love going to churches. And in my room, in a corner, I have a little kandili and a couple of icons that I bought when I was in Istanbul. So what the hell does that say about me? I can't even process that particular thing. So really, I can't talk about religion.
The Dionysian and the Apollonian element in one, of course, I can understand. We are so. Now, having said that, it's very good that we have to finish now with the devil, appearing the incarnation of the devil here. I don't know, we've gone too far. Sorry for keeping you for so long. I hope it was very interesting. I would like to discuss what are you planning against this community in the future? Against or for, maybe the against can be for, just.
I don't think I've got any specific plans, either for
another book probably that will hurl it against them and say,
no, interestingly,
wake up.
So I'm a very slow writer, and I'm still living on The Good Greek Girl, which came out in 2015, so I'm not doing too badly, given it's still kind of at the back. I can hear my publisher saying, Maria, talk about the book and talk about Dmetri's books as Dmetri's publisher. But only recently have I started to put pen to paper about another book, and it's interesting how you talk about you come back to the same sort of circles and the same themes. I'm a non-fiction writer. I cannot write fiction to save my life, so I'm an essayist, a memoirist. This is a conversation for another day, but in the last kind of couple of years, I've taken up competitive powerlifting, and it has Excuse me, I won a gold medal at the Australian Masters last year, which I'm very proud of. Oh. I know. And what that relationship has done with powerlifting, which is again an accidental relationship, everything I do is kind of ends up being a bit by accident. It's actually transformed it's rescued my relationship with my mind, so it's really helped my mental health. But it's kind of the unspoken that I didn't really touch on because I wasn't ready to talk about it in Good Greek Girl, which is a relationship with my body and my weight, which has been exacerbated by the cocktail of drugs that I take that's really kind of stacked on the kilos, and it's really made me feel the antidepressants, just cost-benefit analysis, go off them and I'll end up back in hospital. But all of a sudden I have found a sport, and it is a sport, and I've got a professional coach who actually calls me an athlete. But there's a sport that actually acknowledges and recognises me because there's a super heavyweight category, right? And they don't bat an eyelid about the super heavyweights, even though when I compete I wear the onesie, the lycra that comes at the knees, a very fetching kind of look. So it's incredibly accepting as a sport. So I want to write about my relationship. My next book's going to be about, which I've started to sketch out, about my relationship with powerlifting, but also the relationship that has led to with my body and also with my mind. And there will be a little bit of nostalgia in that, and kind of nostalgia will be if people want to hark back to the days of the 70s and Tab Cola and limits meals and all of those sorts of things. Because I look at the photos of myself and I was a really healthy 14-year-old and I wonder, why did I subject myself to that? So that's what it's kind of stirring about in there.
So, Dmetri?
I go to the gym and for the last 7 years I've only just been struggling with 10 kilograms. It's like, whatever, sort of like, yeah, whatever. The next book is fiction. It's the best way I can probably describe it is to say it's a gothic psychodrama set in the Australian outback, in which I incorporate Ovid, Metamorphosis, with the Arabian Nights. So it's and my main character is an Afghan Aboriginal lesbian woman.
Wow.
So you should read it. So I'm going for a pluralistic venture.
That's the future of the Greek community. Alternative pluralism. Thank you so much, both of you. That's a great. Thank you. Thank you.
If anyone has any questions, it's,
We finished. Any questions? Do you have any questions? You're like, nobody wants to go. Why? Just ask.
Stay here. We want more.
You want more? You want more? Let's have a drink and discuss it. Doc, thank you so much, George and the community for organising. Hope you find it interesting. And Maria and Dmetri. The important thing is to see Greek names in English books. This is what I think is important. Not simply Greek, any kind of non-English names in English books. This is very important. It's a statement of identity, belonging, and in this case of a future, just right, for the future of writing. Thank you so much, all of you. And there's 3 days of intense osmosis, as the Greeks would say.
osmosis.